This is a pretty similar question. So if you don't mind, rather than repeating the question, just follow on a train of thought of the discussion you've just had with Deputy Nash and Bríd Cronin, and just ask you to repeat again what you said earlier on about the groups you met, because you said it very quickly, and I'd like to just take note that you said you met various groups in the Defence Forces, retired Defence Forces, and some other group and some other group, as well as the Women of Honour. Was I right in picking that up, or that you were in touch with them or had a meeting with them? Yeah, could you just run through it again, please? And really what I'm getting at before you answer it is, what's the purpose of meeting them all if the whole basis of this was to address the concerns of the Women of Honour?
I think the purpose of this is to inquire into the entire culture within the Defence Forces in respect of sexual assault in particular, in respect of abuse, and all the recommendations that came from the Independent Review Group. I mean, the Independent Review Group recommended a statutory inquiry covering a range of issues, particularly the degree to which the complaint system within the Defence Forces was effective or not in respect of complaints of abuse in particular, and a whole range of other areas, reprisals and so on. So that is the purpose of the statutory inquiry. And everybody in the Defence Forces has a stake in this, Deputy. Everybody.
So could you
I mean, everybody serving in the Defence Forces has an interest in this. Everybody, I think people who've retired have asked to make an input. We've heard people. It doesn't mean we accept every case that is made. I'll just give you a list of, if that's the question I have here, which I gave earlier, in fairness.
You did, yeah?
No, I didn't go fast either. Yeah. But look, in fairness to the Deputy, I don't have an issue.
You're only obliged to answer the question that you're asked. The question's on the
No, I just quickly, I met the Women of Honour group. I met twice now at this stage. I met with the Taoiseach as well, the Women of Honour group. And so that's 3 times I've met Women of Honour group. I've met PD Fora and RACO, who represent serving members in the Defence Forces. The Defence Forces Veterans Association. The Men and Women of Honour group have also made their representations. They have a different approach and so forth, but they're legitimate as well, and their views are. And then the Secretary-General met with civil service and civilian unions. Just in terms of the question, we've agreed to the Independent Review Group's 13 recommendations. The statutory inquiry, we're establishing that to investigate whether there have been serious systemic failures in dealing with individual complaints in relation to interpersonal issues, including but not limited to sexual misconduct. It was just one of the recommendations that has been implemented. And I've consulted with the Attorney General in respect of the establishment of the inquiry. His office has assisted in the preparation of the draft terms of reference. I just referenced that I've met with the key stakeholders. And there's been a lot of interaction in respect of the terms of reference to date. There'll be further interactions. And the Women of Honour group have, through their legal representatives, forwarded substantive correspondence again today, and there'll be further engagement on those terms of reference.
Okay, so if I might just flesh out the question a bit more. The question about the terms of reference, the Women of Honour presented you with what they recommended as terms of reference, which should be broader, which would make an inquiry more transparent, more open, and they wanted to be more public. Now, meeting them to deal with their terms of reference choices or queries or preferences, does that mean that then if you go and meet with, other organisations that represent serving members or veteran associations group, not picking them out particularly, but just out of the list you read, could there be a conflict of interest in terms of the terms of reference and how they are structured when you're meeting with so many different groups? And is the purpose here not to delve down into what the Women of Honour expose themselves, which is a culture of misogyny, discrimination, and sometimes violence and secrecy in the Defence Forces? And I get it what you're saying, that everybody would be involved in the inquiry, but in establishing the actual terms of reference, was it wrong to include everybody and not just to look at their suggestions?
Well, first of all, we drafted the draft terms predominantly in line with the Independent Review Group's recommendations, Judge O'Hanlon's recommendations. So we drafted terms of reference. That's my responsibility. We shared it with all of the groups, including Women of Honour and Women and Men of Honour. Women and Men of Honour. They came back with suggested amendments and changes. We met to discuss those amendments and changes. There will be further engagement in respect of those terms of reference. I believe the terms of reference are very broad. I don't believe they're too narrow. In terms of transparency, the issue is, do you have a commission of inquiry where the disposition is to be more in camera, and the judge can opt to go public in certain situations, or do you do a full tribunal of inquiry, which is pre-disposition is more public, although the judge can opt to go in camera to hear evidence from people. And I've shared the issues, the pros and the cons, if you like, of both approaches with Women of Honour in particular, and with other groups, but in particular with Women of Honour. And my concern is that we facilitate the maximum participation in the inquiry. And we have to weigh up which model is optimal in terms of people coming forward. I want the maximum number of people coming forward. So there can be conflicts or different perspectives, perhaps might be a better way of putting it, but I'm very alive to those. But on the other hand, I think it would not have been acceptable to ignore completely the representative organisations of the Defence Forces, for example. I just feel that would not have been acceptable. I think the serving women in the Defence Forces, I found their perspective very insightful.
Thank you, Tánaiste.
I'm anxious that...
Time, I'm afraid.
Sorry.
Sorry, no. We benefit from the changeover.
Chuck, I don't want to dwell this out because I'm trying to pull it out in my own head as well. If you shared the draft terms of reference with everybody, we know very publicly that the Women of Honour came back with their suggestions on the draft terms of reference, which had about 15 grounds that an inquiry should investigate, and they asked for open and full transparency. Did other groups whom you shared it with also come back with changes, suggested changes, or different types of terms of reference, or added terms to your terms of reference? I'm just trying to find out how expansive your structures are when the whole origins of the inquiry into the culture of the Defence Forces stems from the expose that the Women of Honour did on that culture. So how far-reaching has your structure been in setting up the terms of reference?
Well, very far-reaching. It's very much based on the independent review group, to be frank, which, in my view, probably exceeded people's expectations in terms of the clarity of its language. Although it's not a finding of fact, and the judge was clear on that, but nonetheless the conclusions are very, very stark and shocking, as I said in the Dáil. And the objective of the exercise is to have findings of fact in respect of those issues that were raised by Women of Honour, and also in terms of the independent review group, in a statutory inquiry with due rigour. And the issues and the terms of reference are broad, in line with the independent review group. But we do have to have a focus, and this is part of the discussion I've had with Women of Honour. We do have to have a focus on a timely, effective and efficient inquiry. And I think terms of reference are a factor in that. In terms of transparency, the issues around the public versus the Commission approach. There are kind of two essential models in legislation at the moment for statutory inquiries. And we've heard what Women of Honour have had to say about that. We've heard what others have had to say about that. There will be further discussions, and we'll come back in terms of a final position on that and the terms of reference.